In this video, I'm going to draw this thing. It'll be a fully narrated real-time sketching session where I sketch some characters that I've actually already designed. See, I'm starting up production on some Star Atlas Core comic book episodes after a little bit of a break doing a lot of writing for the same book. And it's really important to refresh your memory and remember how to actually draw these characters in the first place. I often do this if I take a little bit of a break from drawing characters, really figure out how they work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about getting consistent characters and what it takes. And as we sort of go through this process, I'll just sort of talk through some of the challenges that I'm probably going to face, figuring out exactly how to get these characters looking on model. But before we do that, let's check out Akira Toriyama's The World. This is one of my absolute favorite art books. I think it's also one of my oldest art books, one of the ones I've had for the longest in my collection. You can see I actually have two copies. This is the one with the pages that are falling out. This inspired me a huge amount really early on and taught me about how important craft and perspective and rendering and understanding how to draw form was, even for something like manga. I think it has actually been a major part of a lot of my artistic DNA. Now, I also want to touch on another topic that I've gotten a couple of comments around on the channel, and this is the idea of the mythical AI director. This idea that, like, look, if AI can create art and it can create stories and it can create all this stuff, then isn't everyone just going to become a director? And how hard is it actually to create a movie or, again, a comic book project? Like, everyone is surely going to be able to do this. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about what it takes to actually create one of these larger works, and I thought this would be a good topic to discuss. Again, a little bit more of this kind of AI hype and sort of how I view it relating to larger creative practice, to actually making things that I feel like are sort of valuable. So anyway, we'll discuss that. And yeah, as usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is not going to be fast-paced nor heavily edited. This is just real-time, you and me. We're going to do some sketching, talk about art and AI hype and all that kind of fun stuff. So anyway, hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you will join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about illustration and picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It charts my journey going from an amateur to a professional, and I talk a lot about really important issues such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to plan your images, create thumbnails, and also a few thoughts on how to approach being a professional artist. As I said, it's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out if that's something you're interested in. Akira Toriyama's The World is, look, I think this is my original copy of this. I actually have two. This one has the pages falling out. I got this one super early on. I had a really good friend in high school who kind of got me into art, and he was Japanese and he had sort of moved to Australia, sort of fairly early on, but he sort of grew up in Japan, and like most people, they're really into manga, and he sort of drew manga, and he was kind of really into sort of art. And this was one of these things where I kind of got a really good view into, I think, what a lot of Japanese art is about, and the difference between how often, like, Dragon Ball is, I think, because again, if you're not aware, Akira Toriyama created Dragon Ball, one of the most sort of prototypical mangas that was introduced to the Western sort of audience, really sort of early on, mostly through the anime. But again, the manga is really good, especially like the early episodes of Dragon Ball are just so well drawn, so crazy. And I guess this was where, like, you would see a lot of this stuff that, like, people imagine as prototypically manga, right? Big eyes, big faces, these sort of really cute girls, and people doing sort of fighting and stuff. But I think it was looking at this book and understanding how much of an accomplished draftsperson Toriyama was just kind of blew my mind, right? Because I would look at sort of the stuff that people would draw in their sketchbooks, right, following manga, and I think a lot of Western artists and, sort of kids, in high school who are like, oh, I love Dragon Ball, I love manga stuff, they all draw the really generic stuff, and it was seeing a lot of these, you can see like how much of my entire existence as an artist is based off this book. Like how often do I draw like sort of people riding on these kind of weird dragony creatures and stuff. And I always just like, I was totally fascinated by how he drew all these saddles and all this kind of stuff just looked super tight. And it's that lack of understanding that I think most people had about manga at the time, that it was just sort of simple and poorly drawn. And I just sort of understood like how good Toriyama was and how good you needed to be to draw manga. And it gave me a real insight into the craft, right? And just sort of what manga was all about. Because even though, Dragon Ball is, sort of drawn in a manga style, it's sort of pretty quick. All the cars and all the devices and stuff was sort of really well drawn. And it really made it clear that like this style, this Toriyama style was a choice, right? That he was doing this for a reason. And you could just see like the level of structure, right? Like getting all these freaking things here, getting all the stirrups and the saddles and getting them to connect again. Like you can see literally, this is just like, it's in my brain, right? Like this is an important thing to do. Like the reference and if you look, I think even at the back of this book, you can kind of see, obviously he was, one of those people who's really into making sort of model cars and stuff. But yeah, I just felt like this was like such an amazing book, such a cool thing. And also like the different styles, there would be the, really sort of graphic stuff that he did. And I think this opened up like a whole new world for me, understanding, that he did the designs for Dragon Quest. And then, he did the designs for Chrono Trigger, for, the Super Nintendo RPG. Yeah, just like super crazy. And yeah, just seeing all the stuff that he did, all the cool, interesting designs really kind of blew my mind, right? Like before really looking at this book, I just had no appreciation for manga, I had no appreciation for the craft involved, and I didn't really get it. And I think this just told me like really early on, you need to get really, really good at drawing if you want to become a comic book artist, right? Even if you want to just sort of draw simple manga stuff, right? That there really was no such thing. And yeah, this just kind of it opened up an entire new world, really, quite honestly, for how good drawing could be from a technical perspective. And I think before this, I'd seen a lot of sort of comic books and bits and pieces, but just the level of perspective and rendering and character design, right? I think Toriyama really, now that I kind of think about it, it's interesting now, I'm sort of looking at it, but I think he really does embody like a lot of what I think is so kind of fun about drawing and I think like what a good sort of fantasy artist, really does, designing all these different worlds and having a high level of craft, high level of imagination, sort of dedication. So yeah, anyway, always been a fan of Akira Toriyama, even though he is responsible for a lot of people thinking manga is really, really simple. But you can see this stuff this is completely part of my sort of artistic DNA. So I think one of the biggest challenges when it comes to creating comics is creating consistent characters and really figuring out what are all the little tricks and also the structural things, like how do you represent them dimensionally, but also what are all the little facial features, the little tweaks, the little things that really make a difference? It's often little lines and things that I think we sort of learn over time to really dial in a character and figure out how to make it look like the character, both from a like image perspective, but also from an emotional perspective, like the way it acts, the way it creates different sort of emotions and facial expressions, etc. So this is one of those things that's really quite tricky, and I find that, if I take a little bit of a break, it's easy to kind of get the character mostly right, but forget some of those kind of little things. So often I just do a couple of sketching sessions to kind of just dial everything in, and that's a big part of what I'm going to do here. And again, I did just want to sort of expand before I kind of jump into drawing, because when I jump into drawing, my brain stops working a little bit. Talk about the idea of the AI director, just to kind of clarify what I'm talking about. And this is because I feel like I got a couple of really good comments when I talked about AI in previous videos about how, like, maybe I'm just not, or a lot of artists are just not really understanding how powerful AI will get and how, like what does it actually take to be a director, right? Like, isn't it kind of just easy to sort of have an idea for a story or a movie or a game or whatever, and then just kind of speak it into existence with AI. And I guess I would push back on that for a number of reasons, and I kind of have said, like, people are going to find this is very challenging to actually come up with some product or story that is actually good. And there's a lot of people trying to make videos and movies and cinematography or whatever you want to call it with AI. And I think they're having like not much success, quite honestly. I think it's good at doing some really psychedelic cool stuff. It's really going to be a major challenge for people to create stories or gameplay loops or stuff that actually is something people are going to want to watch, right? This is a lot harder than I think most people who aren't like deeply involved in it day to day understand. The complexity of coming up with a story and then breathing it into existence, right? And I guess the challenge is like, well, okay, a lot of that challenge is because you need hundreds of people to make a feature film with modern VFX. And the same would be for a game. And so if you kind of remove that and you just have one person kind of saying, well, I've got an idea, let's just make it, surely everything will just get out of your way and you'll be able to make this magical thing. I don't think so, right? I have a lot of experience with being a solo auteur, writing, drawing, lettering, coloring, creating a whole comic book, and the processes that are sort of involved there. So again, that's kind of what I want to talk about. I think this is an interesting idea. I think you'll learn a little bit also, and we can talk about just what it takes in general and a few sort of ideas about creativity. So again, let me know what you think of this in the comment section down below. I did just want to preface this, before I start drawing, because again, it can be complicated and people can kind of take this the wrong way. I'm super keen to see whether someone could do this with AI. I mean, that would be very interesting. But yeah, most of my experience kind of points to that not being something that's going to happen. Maybe ever, right? Based on the way that LLMs function and the way they kind of can't often tell where they're going, right? So anyway, super interesting topic, I think. Anyway, let me shut up and we'll do some drawing. Okay, so tools for today are going to be a Blackwing matte pencil. I've got the eraser on the end of the Blackwing. And also, if I need, I have a putty eraser or a kneadable eraser, whatever you want to call it. I'm just drawing in a sketchbook here, and I've got a hardbound Strathmore 400 series recycled paper. And it works pretty well. You can kind of draw on it, but it's still kind of a sketchbook, right? Still pretty thin as in the grand scheme of things. And here's an example of basically what we're going to do, which is something I was doing previously. Just kind of draw these characters. I've got Gion Oman and Moda from Star Atlas, and you can kind of see, again, even though I kind of know how to draw them, and I've done it a million times, it's always good to kind of refresh, because often I find as I kind of work on a project, the things can easily sort of drift off model, or again, Gion kind of has these two modes. One is where his sort of hair is slicked back when he's kind of not in the thick of adventure, and then he kind of gets a little bit more ragged as sort of time goes on, and it can be sort of easy to just kind of slide off model a little bit. It's always good to kind of come back and kind of remember, oh, okay, that's exactly what makes that character look like, like they should. And again, this is something that, just requires constant focus, right? It's very easy to, again, sort of just be drawing a panel and be like, oh, that's kind of good enough. And yeah, then it just kind of doesn't work out. So yeah, here's some other sort of sketchbook pages, just kind of messing around. This is normally what I do if I'm just sitting there warming up. Probably should have recorded these sketching sessions as well. But yeah, and sometimes I just do some other thing. I'm always like, what would another Ara book be like? Just draw some sort of idea for what a cover might be. Always trying to design different characters that I feel like sort of might go into that kind of world. Yeah, so this is normally what I do, if I'm just kind of messing around sketchbooks. I draw pretty big. I'm mostly just sort of designing characters, playing around. But yeah, so the Star Atlas core characters, here's like a sort of a cover that's got most of them in there. As I said, I was sort of drawing Moda, but I feel like it's always good for me to sort of dial that in. And yeah, I think I'll just kind of see if I can refresh some of these to kind of remind myself like what is going on. Yeah, and again, I might just do a couple here. I might do this over a couple of sort of sessions. We'll see. But yeah, the first character I think is really good to sort of look at is we'll just sort of sketch these to kind of warm up, and then I really think I need to kind of revisit the sort of tempo character, because I was noticing a couple of those panels weren't quite sort of dialed in. So yeah, if I kind of zoom up there, you can see the characters. Gion is basically just a very sort of prototypical human character. And Motor is this kind of Maurice character who actually ended up having this sort of big chin, although I think in most of the current sort of game models, they do not have that sort of epic sort of chin. But yeah, so that's something that I'd probably, if I was doing a redesign of another Maurice character, I'd probably sort of tweak that later on. But anyway, so yeah, normally what I'm doing here is just I don't often have those up, you know. I'll just often try and sort of start and be like, okay, let's see if we can kind of remember, right? And I find like drawing characters that I've already designed is like a really good way of warming up as well. I always recommend, if you are warming up, yeah, to just kind of draw stuff you're already sort of comfortable with. And the general sort of style that I'm working with for core as well is that the kind of noses are a little bit sort of smaller. But yeah, I've always just got to remind myself that Gion kind of has this kind of pretty standard kind of pointy little nose. Boom. But other than that, he's kind of just a basic sort of human character. So we're going to have the mouth again somewhere at the bottom of that Loomis sphere construction. Going to have ears somewhere there. Right. And he has this kind of just very typical sort of action hero vibe, right? Which again, it is part of the story, right? Like part of the story is kind of thinking about like, what would one of these guys actually, what would happen to it, to a normal kind of human if they were actually kind of dumped in some science fiction environment that was not designed for them, right? would they cope, right? Yeah, my sort of view of this is that the humans are not necessarily the most sort of advanced or noble sort of species. They're kind of a little bit just sort of in the middle. So yeah, he kind of represents a lot of what a typical sort of human from the viewpoint of like sort of Hollywood, and how Hollywood sort of normally represents that, right? That was kind of one of the things that I thought would be interesting. Because obviously humans come in all shapes and sizes, but this is really talking about that idea of your kind of American superhero, American sort of heroic character, right? Your prototypical sort of 80s action character. Yeah, so again, he's got pretty sort of standard structure. Just like simple mouth. Again, the style here is really, really basic. And normally with a lot of these, I like to sort of block in both the cheekbones and the kind of eye sockets, because I find that's a really good way to just make sure there's enough room everywhere to actually kind of draw the character. Just adding a bit of stuff. We'll see how we go here. See if I can move that over there. This way I can tilt this up. Boom. Yeah, see it a little bit better. So yeah, this is this is not like a lengthy process, but yeah, definitely spend a bit of time doing this just to make sure that A, we're kind of warming up, and B, we're kind of warming up with the right material. And most of the time I can kind of do this by memory, right? This is like pretty easy, obviously, but yeah, it's always good to take those assumptions of what sort of makes the character and then put it into practice. Because yeah, it's often very kind of subtle things that will actually make a character feel like they are that character, right? Especially when you've got someone like sort of Jian here, who is just a standard character, right? That there's very little sort of distinguishing features. So yeah, he kind of has pretty iconographic kind of eyes. Well, and that's the basic sort of idea. Late stage hominid struggling to survive in what is a very complicated world full of aliens and various artificial intelligences and stuff, which again is probably a good lead in to talk about some of that sort of AI stuff. And it's interesting, again, sort of listening to all the comments that I get when I make sort of videos on AI, like the. Again, it feels like everyone is kind of just knee-jerking when it comes to most of these kind of arguments. Again, I like to point out that, I do spend a fair bit of time, and I have spent quite a fair bit of time thinking about the concept of actual sentient artificial intelligence way before, the LLM sort of craze came about, right? We put a lot of thought into how exactly like an advanced AI would sort of actually function, and just like you have to sort of really think about what potentially might be possible, right? Even for a comic book project, right? It's still the case that you really need to do to have a go at the actual science fiction of it and think about what is consciousness. How would an artificial intelligence be different, right? Like, would it be like Skynet? Would it be like something completely different? Again, these are ideas that are born from human psychosis often, and Jungian and Freudian sort of archetypes and fears and a lot of these kind of things, right? And a lot of science fiction is commentating on the present, right? 1984 classically is commentating on some of the things that Orwell kind of saw happening in his time, right? 1948. And I think it's often important to understand that, in the same way that James Cameron's Terminator was like, again, if you listen to him sort of talk about, I think there's a great sort of masterclass, the masterclass sort of, I think, .com sort of online sort of course platform. They have a good series with James Cameron, and he talks about how the idea of like the Terminator came to him in a dream, right? That he saw this character, right, in the flames, right? Like the Terminator with the skin being burnt off, and it's like this dream image that he saw where he kind of knew what the story was about because it was a dream, right? So he kind of saw the image that was a very sort of striking image, and he also understood that, the reason it was this kind of metal exoskeleton is because it had been burnt off, and it had been burnt off because it was actually sort of a robot under there. And again, it's just such a cool idea, right? Like such a cool image. I think we'll have a go here at sort of drawing Moda again. And again, like that also speaks to the way that I think often good ideas are born is from the subconscious, right? And it is a mix of all these sort of different things coming together. And it's that kind of stuff that AI really kind of struggles with, right? And that is because often we are speaking to fears and talking about fears and things that are manifested through the subconscious and the collective subconscious and the cultural zeitgeist and all these kind of ideas, these concepts of idea space, right? That are very metaphysical, and again, a lot of people just are like, oh, that's sort of crazy. But yet people are honestly taking a lot of AI progression based on what I call the Terminator fallacy, which is like people have seen the Terminator movie and they literally think that is reality. And a lot of those people are, often don't have a lot of experience with technology cycles or understanding, that often you see technology where everyone was hyped about it and everyone was like, this is the future, this is what's going to happen, everything's going to be like this. And then 30, 40 years later, you're like, that never really happened, right? Like that didn't pan out. And again, you just don't know when you're in the middle of it, right? Like everyone sort of imagines like, oh, this is obvious. It is not obvious. And I think that, again, a lot of people are just basing a lot of their assumptions off science fiction. And a lot of the people who are chasing the idea of AI from a career perspective, again, are doing it based on science fiction and concepts of sort of manifest destiny of a particular sort of outcome. And because they're not, this is, I guess, the difference, is because they're not creatives and they don't understand how often, I think a lot of people, again, this is a hot take, but I think a lot of people who seem very, very much into AI often struggle on an emotional level. And you can see this if you listen to like a Lex Friedman versus John Carmack, right, sort of interview or something like that. Two really intelligent people talking about AI, but two people who really struggle to, I think, comprehend and understand their own humanity and emotional sort of state. And again, I just think that it's very hard for people to separate their own ideas from this kind of, like what they want to happen on an emotional level from sort of what is sort of actually happening on the technological level, and a desire to reduce a lot of their emotions to simple calculations, let's say. That again, I'd say that's probably the closest to an actual kind of hot take on that. Which is to say, like, I think both of those individuals are extremely talented and have super interesting things to say. But yeah. Anyway, that I forget what exactly sort of got me to talk about that. But there's basically a delta between people fantasizing about AI and robotics and what is and isn't possible, and what is actually going to be dangerous and the actual reality of it, right? And I think the more you sort of get into different bits of YouTube, the more people will start to talk about this and how the fact that chatbots, like the fact that ChatGPT is a chatbot, it has a major influence on how people see it, right? Because we tend to anthropomorphize all sorts of stuff. So anyway, the point here is that directorial creation, I think, is something that a lot of people don't really understand. And I think we can just step back from first principles and look at lots of scenarios where, I think anyone essentially can create anything, right? Such as being a novelist, where like everyone has access to this and you can see the struggles that people have to actually create something interesting. And often the dangers of formula, right? Of sort of trying to reduce things to algorithms. But yeah, it's very, the whole thing to me is sort of very, very interesting. And again, part of the interest is seeing how humans respond to this, right? Because again, that gives you lots of good sort of story ideas. So, yeah. And again, I think it's always tricky as an artist or someone who you're deriving your income from a particular thing. And I would very much, I think I said this in one of the videos, that I'd be super happy if AI just went away. And that was viewed as being just completely out of touch. But again, that's just, again, I'm trying to state what would be a very sort of obvious point of view, but it's important to state that, I'm obviously aware that I'm sort of biased because I'm an artist. But again, there was a couple of comments there that sort of spoke about how surely everyone has good ideas and artists and directors don't have any sort of monopoly on ideas, and that, one of the reasons why people can't just kind of make the stuff that they want to make is because they just don't have the ability to kind of make movies, right? And that as soon as people are going to be able to create these things with AI that, is it really that hard? And I guess this is like an interesting question. And I do sort of come at it from the perspective of trying to, again, come up with an open mind. But I think it should be obvious from the perspective of most people who actually try and do that, that the whole thing is very, very complicated and very, very challenging. And we can look at a couple of good examples of sort of why that is the case. But it would be interesting, right? Because a lot of the reasons that, I think directors get good and get sort of better and better and better at making films is, they just sort of have experience, right? And experience really is the thing that will build that creative muscle, will build your kind of ability to, just understand how things function. And, it's just unfortunate that there aren't as many opportunities for people to become good sort of directors, because it costs just so much money to sort of even get started. And I guess the idea is that, if you have an idea, surely AI can just come along and manifest that idea. And there are quite a few people on YouTube kind of talking about AI cinematography and, making short films with AI, or potentially making feature films with AI. And I think, again, the thing that I would sort of say that I kind of noticed with a lot of this is there's always like really good sort of demos of how these sort of models that can create AI video actually work. And I think that they are often really geared towards maximizing what AI is good at and really sort of ignoring what it's terrible at. And again, I guess there's a couple of questions. There's like, is it going to get better? So we can talk about like, is it going to get better? Oh yeah, we can talk about if it's going to get better. But I think you can see from the evidence so far that having the power to create any sort of scene or whatever is not necessarily capable. It's not possible to do that yet. And B, it doesn't necessarily mean that you get a good story or a good product, right? So most of the AI films that I've kind of seen feel exactly what you would expect, which is like, this feels like a student film of someone who is, doesn't really have a voice and is using a lot of sort of cliches and pastiche and all this kind of stuff. It's none of it is sort of very original. Most of it doesn't make any sense. And the visuals are just slightly better than what you would get from a student film. So they have this kind of art house vibe that most of them don't make much sense. They haven't studied cinematography. They don't understand most of the rules involved and how you actually tell a story and the pacing and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of like very low grade student work that just tends to have like sometimes a really sort of high quality polish on it, on these scenes that don't really go together or sort of work. So a student film probably makes more sense because they actually have the ability to control the shots a little bit better, but you get this same kind of vibe that I get when I look at kind of student short films or something like that, which is like often not a lot of craft, and that's often what you get. And again, there are really good student films, right? And people who are going to really good film schools and stuff, but I mean, the kind of stuff where it's like a sort of high school student sort of level, right? That's kind of what it looks like to me, for better or worse. And I'm like, there's nothing wrong with that. That's how everyone learns, but it's not like the technology enables anything at all, really, from a creative standpoint. Now, what it does is gives you the ability to create shots and things that feel like they have some quality of cinematography. So you can get really good images that feel like, the lighting is really interesting. And you have like, it feels like you could potentially have these things where there's a really high budget for VFX and creatures and concepts and ideas and surreal things that would be very challenging and sort of hard to make if you were, just kind of trying to make that with a traditional VFX pipeline. But yeah, it's sort of not there from a like, could you even do it, right? it's very unclear to me whether or not you could do that at all, just based on the technology. Now, again, I guess the thing here is like, quote unquote, it will get better. It is Skynet. I just don't sort of get it. And again, I'm fully willing for that to be a potentiality. But I think in order to make those claims, you actually have to, I guess, understand the limitations of the technology. And, you have to give a date and say like, oh, okay, by this time, right? Like that's actually going to happen, right? It's easy to just say, well, infinitely, it'll get better. But there's a couple of basic limitations of it. And I think there's a couple of basic limitations of the craft that is required to actually make a good story or make something. And this is something that I know a lot about, right? I'm trying, and one of the things I'm really interested in is writing stories. And it is challenging, right? I would not claim that, I get it right, or that, I know something that other people don't about writing good stories. It's immensely challenging. But I think we can sort of zoom out and look at it from a couple of perspectives. The first is to look at examples where people have the ability and there is no gatekeeping, like no one's stopping you from going and making your own thing. Yet people still struggle to make sort of good art or good stories or good products that people care about or will part money for, that are actually going to replace someone. And a lot of that, it's quite frankly not in comic books, because making a comic book is quite challenging and requires a lot of time and effort. But with the idea of writing a novel, it's there, right? Like anyone these days can write a novel. You can write a novel. I can write a novel. You can very easily search YouTube and look at people talking about a lot of great strategies for writing 5,000, 2,000, 10,000 words a day, and just sort of cranking out novels. And a lot of people are doing this, and the information of how you can potentially make money from it and make a career out of that are widely available. There's very few gatekeepers on being an author and just making everything yourself. And, again, you could probably use AI to help you with that if you wanted, but really the speed it takes to write a novel these days, and given the ability to edit it, to publish it, that there's really nothing stopping anyone from doing that, except that, they kind of don't, like it's hard, right? It's hard, but there's no real sort of roadblocks like there used to be. And I think you can notice a couple of things. One is that a lot of people get pretty good at making novels, right? And I've read quite a few, sort of novels made by people who are just sort of self-publishing, putting stuff out on Amazon, print on demand, or just sort of on Kindle, or, again, often they do get made into audiobooks. It's also quite easy, and it will be a lot easier if you can just do text to speech to have audiobook versions of these things. The problem is, you're just not really seeing some sort of massive explosion in quality, right? It is just still generally very challenging for people to make good stories, because you need to really think about this, right? You need to have a good creative process for doing it. The other thing you can see is that, and again, that's not necessarily some proof that because of that, then AI will never succeed. This is inductive versus deductive logic, right? We're looking at sort of data points and trying to derive some probability, which again is like, it's an important distinction for people who are going to sort of criticize that, I guess, sort of way of thinking, and that's probably tricky to be deterministic about something like AI and how it will turn out. You probably have to look to inductive logic or some, again, sort of colloquial version of that. But people also have trouble replicating their success. So someone who has written a really great novel, it's often non-trivial for them to repeat that success, to go on and actually create something that was, again, as good as that. Let's see if I can draw Timpo, this sort of robot character, right? See if I can draw this guy now. Again, that's a side view. I'll see if I can come up with a front view in a minute. But that's kind of the real challenge that I kind of see there, is that, we don't see a lot of evidence of, okay, it's completely democratized, right? You can write Most people can write. If you can't write, you probably can't write into ChatGPT to make a movie. So it's the same level of availability. There's tons of information on it. And people find a real hard time doing that. And also, as I said, they have trouble replicating their own success, right? Like you have authors who have done well, right? Like they've done quite well. They've made a book that people really kind of care about, and yet they struggle to make another one that's as good, to capture that magic. And I think this is where you really have to look at and understand the degree to which some of this stuff is capturing magic in a bottle. And so much of these ideas of story do come from the, people hitting the zeitgeist, really hitting and finding something within themselves to write about and make like a really interesting story. It's non-trivial to just do this, right? I think there's a real assumption that like, you just kind of have an idea and then you sort of put it down. It's like, yeah, that's possible, but the problem is often it's just not that interesting. It's just not that enticing. Even with something like a novel, right? Again, people have a real sort of hard time figuring out how to actually systemize even their own process. Okay, the problem with AI is that that's kind of how it functions, right? Like it is really good at systemizing and replicating and creating formulas and using averages. And what you kind of see with story and a lot of other things like video games is that even when people try and do that, it's very challenging and it normally doesn't work, right? You can see the same thing with sequels to movies, sequels to video games, sequels to books, right? People have the thing, it's there, it's laid out. What's the problem, right? Like why do sequels suck? Like why is it not interesting? And like why haven't humans been able to figure this out? So imagining that an AI is going to figure this out, I think is kind of hubris to a certain degree. It's possible. Again, I'm open to the possibility. But I think this is where you really have to look at like the evidence for what is kind of out there and understand that getting this magic in a bottle is kind of tricky. And I think it does require people to reinvent themselves as authors and artists and really figure out what they're saying and what this thing is about. And you can kind of feel when someone's phoning something in, when they're just like, this is kind of just the same scene as last time, right? It's the same story as last time. It doesn't have the same amount of energy. Again, speaking of that, it's like, it's always tricky to even draw your own characters that you freaking designed before, right? Again, like AI has trouble with that. Like I have trouble with that. There's constant creative process, right? And again, even drawing a character, I'm like, I know how it goes. I'm kind of going to be able to put most of the things in place. But like sometimes if you're sleeping on the job, which sometimes we are as artists, sometimes we're really sort of pressed for time. It's the right thing, but it just doesn't feel right. And that's where a lot of these things are so mysterious. And again, if you're, and this is where I think my commentary often comes across as extremely offensive to people, but if you just haven't had experience doing this stuff, it's very hard to understand what goes into it and what are the challenges that you will face. And I think there's often that's where people start getting super upset and sort of yelling in the comments, because I'm saying that if you haven't had experience like making one of these products and going through the process, it's very tricky to anticipate like the challenges that are involved. That's why it's so important to do it if you want to do it, and sort of see how you go and see what challenges that come up and learn and adapt and all that kind of fun stuff. So I think, that there's just massive challenges there that seem obvious. And I guess the response to that is to kind of say, well, AI is just magic and it's going to solve that. And I think that's where you have to kind of step back and really be like, oh, okay, let's kind of be honest here, right? That's a big leap, right? Just kind of saying like AI because magic, like it's just gonna come through and it's gonna be so much smarter. The trick is to understand that there are fundamental limitations with the idea of an LLM and how it sort of functions, which is that is a similar way that the generative imagery is created. Or a lot of this technology we're seeing that we call AI is based off stuff that I'd have no clue about, right? But it's basically some sort of innovation of this kind of transformer model, which I know nothing about, but it allows a particular type of stuff to happen where things get kind of combined and recombined. But there's limitations because it's based on prediction, right? It's based on the AI model being able to predict what's next, like what pixel comes after this, what word comes after this. But if you use AI like ChatGPT for any sort of period of time, you quickly kind of realize that it can't see ahead in time. It's just a fundamental limitation of the technology. It's not going anywhere. It's not starting like, and this is where you get into story structure and the challenges that you tend to face with any project. Not just based on sort of story structure and the hero's journey or whatever sort of story paradigm you're kind of using, but you kind of have like a start, a middle, and an end, right? And the problem is that even if you kind of say, okay, Stephen King is a famous pantser. He writes by the seat of his pants. He just kind of starts at the start and doesn't really know where it's going. And he kind of just blathers on. And sometimes the stories are like amazing and sometimes they're not, right? Like not every Stephen King story is amazing. But, I think everyone still appreciates his sort of artistry and you'll always give it a go. And even if the end is not great, often the journey there is like pretty good. There's something to this idea of like, oh, maybe you don't need to know where you're going. Maybe this is consciousness. Maybe it's just maybe we're all just sort of guessing what's next, right? This is the philosophical argument. And let me know in the comments down below whether I've completely lost you by this point and we've sort of delved. We've gone way too far into philosophical AI land. But again, I mean, this is the stuff I literally think about when I'm designing Temple, the robot here, who is sort of broken and disconnected from his sort of Wi-Fi network and is kind of out on his own, right? And not part of his sort of collective consciousness of the rest of his kind of AI people. Like you kind of have to go there. You kind of have to think of sort of crazy things. But yeah, okay, maybe consciousness is like that. You just start and you don't really know where you're going, and we're just kind of making it all up as we go along, right? Okay. But I think there's other elements that you have to kind of consider that are probably playing a part there, which is one of is the human intuition and the human subconscious, right? So like maybe Stephen King's conscious mind doesn't understand where he's going, but maybe his intuition and his subconscious mind has built up a lot of understanding for as we kind of go through and weave plot threads and kind of crazy stuff happens. Even though it's kind of you're building the footpath as you kind of go, I think there's a lot of intuition that happens where in the human mind where people are actually kind of headed towards something, right? And it's built not on sort of some logical plot point, right? It's not an outline, but there is an endpoint in mind that is very much sort of linked to unconscious sort of thought and thinking about what's happening and how that person's emotions like affect the different characters and building characters and seeing where they go and just kind of writing and seeing what happens, right? There is a lot that is leading that and linking that, which is the actual human mind, which is not limited by this kind of very, very simple sort of linear algebra nonsense, right? I think it is a lot more complicated. And I think you see that in the output. So an LLM doesn't know where it's going. And once you kind of understand that, you really realize that it's very hard to corral it. Like it's kind of like herding cats. And again, people are like, oh, well, it's getting better. And I'm like, I don't think it's going to get there because it can't anticipate where it's going. And you can try and overlay other algorithms on it and mess around and try and be like, oh, okay, well, we'll put like a memory AI and a subconscious AI and then a Jungian shadow AI, and we'll kind of try and simulate this. Like, A, it's a lot of compute. B, like maybe that's going to get you there. Maybe that's just all it is. It's just having these sort of different layers. You got your triune brain theory. Maybe you just need to combine a bunch of different LLMs that are, sort of talk to each other and go nuts. Who knows, right? Again, we will see. But at the moment, I think just the fact that it can't tell where it's going, it makes it very limited when it comes to telling stories and very sort of generic, because it's always just kind of going on, like what's already there. Stories and ideas that are already out there. It's just kind of generic. It's just regurgitating nonsense it's kind of seen before. And it's very convincing at that. But yeah, it doesn't matter how convincing it is. It matters whether or not it can do it. And I think just that fundamental limitation of what the technology is, it is just, I don't see a lot of people who are pro AI really sort of talking about just how limited that is, right? And the problems associated with that for creative output. Okay, so again, that is not a conclusive sort of dissertation on it. That's just me randomly talking about thoughts of, why AI I think is kind of limited, and especially when it comes to LLMs, etc. But there's other stuff here that I think is important when it comes to like someone being a director and using AI to just be the cinematographer and everything. It's like, firstly, you don't have a story because the AI can't write a story. So you've got to write a story, which is the whole point. People want to be a director. I've got all these amazing visions. We've now democratized creativity, so you can just make your imagination. The problem is you still have to get it onto the page, which is something that I basically have spent a ridiculous amount of my life trying to build frameworks around and teach people how to do. And I actually have a pretty good understanding of kind of how that stuff works. And the challenge, most importantly, the challenges involved, right? Yeah, in kind of really figuring it out on a good level. And yeah, you're always kind of plagued with this idea of kind of how much do you actually have to plan the story. Like if you're going to make something, if you're just writing a novel, you can just write it and edit it and write it and edit it. It's highly editable. If you're making a film, there is a certain editability to that sort of process, but you still need the shots if you're going to edit them in. You can maybe say, okay, well, but this is it. Like AI just lets you do infinite reshoots, right? Like you can just go in and reshoot that shot. Well, maybe, like maybe that is going to be the thing that kind of really does it. But I think it's often the types of edits that people make are a little bit more complicated than that. And it really speaks to the fact that you kind of need to know what you're doing before you set out. And you need to have a really clear goal of what the end is. This is why elevator pitches are so important in sort of the Hollywood system. This is why people sort of spend so much time kind of talking about and thinking about these ideas. Is if you don't really have a clear idea what your story is about, it's very tricky to end up with anything magically, right? And you only learn that by going in and failing a whole bunch to really sort of get all that stuff to happen. Again, ask me how I know. So there's a degree of vision that I think you need if you're going to create anything. And the idea that you're just going to be able to go around and do reshoots and kind of add bits and pieces in, at some point it just becomes unmanageable. At some point it just becomes very sort of tricky to really just even manage the mistakes that you've kind of made, the tweaks to the story. And basically at some point, I guess you can look at this maybe as like a creative theory where you kind of can't fix something that you've kind of bumbled up. There's not a lot of evidence for that, right? There's far more evidence for, I forget where I sort of heard this sort of metaphor or story. I think it was based on music, right? Like a symphony, right? And the idea is like a symphony or a piece of art is sort of grown like a tree, right? You have like this seed or this germ of an idea, and it kind of needs to seamlessly, completely grow and turn into a tree in like sort of one fluid motion. And if you kind of have to chop tree limbs off and mess around with it halfway through and sort of stick them back on, there's a degree to where like maybe that thing is never going to be a true work of art. Like it's never really going to be that good. And again, I think with film that there's a degree where you can kind of constantly edit the script. But once you kind of start, like the number of stories that have been good after someone kind of decides like, we're going to change director, or let's change this up and we'll just VFX someone's face onto some other thing. We'll just do these reshoots. We'll just start futzing with it halfway through. That just doesn't work, right? That there's no evidence for that working. So if you're going to be using anything close to like a traditional process, right? Like a traditional process for creating things. You kind of have to just be realistic about like what's actually involved in that, and the challenges that you're going to face actually creating something. And the complexity rises as you make something that's closer to feature length. But again, even making a short story is immensely sort of challenging. So I think there's basically just massive problems when you're trying to create a big project that's artistic of any kind. Is you need to have a very clear vision for where you're going. You need to be able to articulate it to yourself or to others. Because again, even as you can see, like I can draw a character and then I will kind of forget halfway through what the point was. Like you need to record these things. You need to have some structure for your creativity. Otherwise it kind of just won't work, right? You need to have an ability to kind of refresh your memory and focus. There's no way someone's just going to be futzing around with AI and they kind of start a film project and you're not really sure where it's going, and then kind of get to the end and, maybe AI will fix it, right? You'll be able to, maybe fix it. But again, getting to the point where an AI can actually fix it without making it more generic or bad, I think is immensely challenging. The only, I guess, idea where you could potentially see this as being something that, sort of might work is if you had... right? Like if you really had some AI that was able to kind of understand everything, right? Some super intelligent AI that was able to understand sort of story structure, like what your intent is, and that if you like need to fix something, that it kind of also knows like what you were thinking and what your point is and kind of everything. Right, like if you have an AI that's so super intelligent that basically when you say, well, I've sort of gotten to I've just gotten before the end, and I realize in order to end my story, I kind of need to, change my main character or the secondary character or the relationship between them, or I realize I need to raise the stakes and I need to then go back and fix it here. The question is like, well, okay, can you get an AI to go back and edit this and then kind of edit the entire film like in real time? Or if you kind of say, actually, I want to change this character design, right? I want to work in some sort of non-linear fashion. I think, I just don't see it, right? That's like a very, very intelligent AI that is much more magic than anything linked to what kind of LLMs do. So this is where I guess we're looking a lot more at concepts of sort of magic or concepts of super intelligence, right? The idea that this is going to come out of an LLM, that it's going to be able to do all that kind of stuff and combine the visuals with the, I don't know. That's fantasy, right? Like that's science fiction stuff at the moment. There's no evidence of it being able to do that or anything kind of even remotely like that. I think that's basically the challenge that people are going to have, is that this is just hard, right? It is hard to create things. It takes a long time, and if you want to kind of find out how challenging it is to kind of really keep a story or keep an idea for a video game or any kind of project consistently through production, just go and do it. Just do it a little bit. I think we find it is very, very challenging, and that it requires a lot of sort of human faculty and intelligence and foresight and creative control and intuition and subconscious sort of mastery and confidence, right? Because you have to The other thing that I think a lot of people don't understand about sort of creativity, this is something I kind of often talk about, is that it's kind of the perception paradox with creating things, right? Is like, okay, you have some AI person who wants to create a thing. They've got a very clear image of what it's going to be in their head. That's one thing. The second thing is like, okay, as soon as you start making that, you kind of have a very different version of it. So typically there's the idea that you have before you start creating something. There's the idea that you have as you are creating it. And often that's very different because now you're struggling to be like, well, this isn't turning out exactly how I wanted. What am I going to do, right? Like, how am I going to fix it, right? Like, how do I change it? Like, what do I tell the AI to do to get it closer to my vision? And then you kind of get blind to it as a human, right? Like, there's just no way around that if you're actually an individual trying to say, I'm going to actually manage this and make it better. And then it comes out at the end and it's finished, and then you actually kind of realize, well, maybe this is completely different to the image that I had in my head in the beginning. And it's very hard to know whether it's any good, right? So it's not obvious that if you're not practiced in this, that you're just going to be able to easily go through and do it. And what I'd say, like, this is a massive skill to build, to be creative, to be a director, to be someone who has an idea and it's clear in their head, and then you just wade into the battle of kind of create it with I mean, even if you literally could just get the AI to kind of just suck the images out of your brain, connecting them together, right, would be like a massive task. Cameras are cheap, right? Like VFX are cheap. Like, just do it the old-fashioned way. Right? Like, I just don't think there's a lot of sort of logic going and trying to use a medium like sort of generative AI, either text or video, and imagining that that's going to be any easier than anything else, right? It's got limitations like anything else. I don't think it's going to be some magical thing that just kind of solves everyone's problems, let's say. It would be interesting to see. It will be interesting to see. So anyway, let me know if that kind of makes sense down below. This is why I kind of said and I sort of said it flippantly, because to me it seems obvious that people who are just kind of sitting there saying like, hey, I've got some vague idea in the beginning, let's make Midjourney or whatever, and then we put it in Runway, and let's kind of get this idea out, and then they kind of say like, oh yeah, cool, like that's exactly what I had, and I sort of said, that's not what you had in mind. You just kind of saw the first thing it kind of spat out, or the 100th thing it sort of spat out, and you're kind of just picking from stuff you like. But try do that over a long project, right? I think what you'll find out is what comes out the other side is just incomprehensible garbage, right? Because what comes out the side of Hollywood productions with hundreds and hundreds of people working on it and trying to figure it out, again, if you don't have a clear vision, if you don't have a good creative process, if the script isn't good and you start producing before you're ready, or whatever other million things can really just completely jack up your project, you just get garbage out the other end that no one's interested in. And the way it normally is garbage is it's generic, it's average, it's stereotypical, it's ideas we've had before, because that's what happens when people mess up, is they try and move it towards the mean. And that's what AI does all day, every day. You have to push against it constantly. You constantly have to remind it to not just be generic and stereotypical. So what comes out of those large projects is just average garbage that most people aren't interested in, despite armies of super talented people trying to get it to look interesting. The thing that often makes the difference, what makes a James Cameron or someone like that, is the vision, the ability to wade through the battle of creation with that vision in mind and execute on it to make it actually good. I just think people have no idea how complicated that is until you try and do it. But figuring out how to do it is immensely interesting and immensely challenging and immensely fun, and something that I would kind of recommend everyone try and do. So, it's not to say that there's very few actual gatekeepers on this, right? Like, this information is all freely available. Cameras are really cheap. VFX are quite cheap and easy to learn. There's probably a bunch of people who want to kind of do this stuff. and AI is going to make all that stuff even better, even easier. It's going to be integrated into VFX. I think that will kind of make everything a lot better, a lot easier. Yeah, I think it's just this idea that that you're going to be able to have sort of everyone easily just directorially knocking out kind of masterpieces, I think is challenging. And maybe that's not what they're actually imagining. But I think that's kind of the narrative. So anyway, I feel like this one has gone on way too long, which again, I do apologize for. I've probably done way more talking than way more kind of drawing. But yeah, let me know what you kind of think of this, whether that kind of helps clarify some of these things. I know that, again, like honestly, if you are fully into AI and you're like, screw you, I'm gonna make it work. I'm like, okay, well, hopefully this has helped you to understand some of the challenges you may encounter. And if you're sort of on the other side of it and you're like, I'm kind of sick of hearing about AI, hopefully this has also sort of assuaged some of your sort of stress or whatever. But yeah, I can't remember whether or not does it go down there or does it go up there? I can't see it on the reference, right? It's the little tech mark go up the top or down the bottom. Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for sure. So anyway, hopefully that has been a fun little session, just talking about AI, some of the challenges of sort of drawing characters. Yeah, I would just, if you're trying to create your own sort of project, just understand this is a challenge, right? Creating consistent characters is always something that I think a lot of people stumble over with comic books, and just realize that, again, part of you overcoming that, or at least this is sort of my case anyway, is like, firstly, a lot of people just draw very standard characters, right? So, if I just kind of draw a standard dude Gion, then I can, draw a fantasy character book or something, and I can basically draw Gion, but, as a barbarian. That's how a lot of people have solved getting consistent faces over time, right? Is they just basically draw the same characters, and they've got like a big chunky character, a skinny little character, right? Like sort of a couple of different female characters they pull from. And these are just archetypes or stereotypes from their library. You can think about it as being the 2 or 3 actors that a director really likes to work with, right? And they're in every film, right? It's like a Wes Anderson film. There's always kind of Bill Murray in there somewhere. It's kind of that, right? People just get good at drawing a couple of characters and then tweaking a few things. It's not that they just magically become able to perfectly replicate different characters because they're just really good at drawing. I think some people maybe are just that sort of good, but I think it's often about tactics. And the other thing is to really think about and just understand you have to keep practicing. You have to kind of remember how a lot of these things go. I still think there's probably a couple of things about tempo here that are sort of, not kind of working. And yeah, it's mostly a matter of tactics and understanding these are the challenges you're going to face. How do we sort of deal with them? How do we make the character super iconic so that even if you mess it up a little bit, it's not going to look like some other character? That's often why you have manga characters where it's like this guy's got black hair and this guy's got sort of white, blonde hair, right? It's because it's easy to tell them apart. This guy's got really spiky hair, right? It's iconic because that's often sort of what makes a difference. So anyway, probably should have talked more about that than wasting our time with AI hype. But either way, hopefully this was entertaining. And speaking of things not being on model, I was just kind of realizing, I just thought I'd check the reference, and yeah, like Tempo doesn't have the sort of domed, right? Doesn't have the domed thing at the top of his head. That is this character. That is Study. And again, it's always these little things that, yeah, it's easy to just kind of forget, right? But yeah, there's things like this, and that totally changes how the character looks. That seems much better. So yeah. Anyway, hopefully this has been instructive and proves my entire point. It's good doing a video like this because, again, the mistakes I make prove my thesis. Anyway, hopefully that was interesting. Other than that, I'll catch you around. Happy drawing.